Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Mr. Raider back for another review session for EP World History. And today we're going to be doing a review of the years 1450 to 1750 Common Era, otherwise known as the First Global Age. So, in terms of thinking about the EP World History modern curriculum, we're going to be looking at Unit 3, Land-Based Empires, and Unit 4, Transoceanic Interconnections over the next 25 to 30 minutes. And the goal really is to give you a review of all of the major key events, individuals, figures, movements that took place and really help to define the rise of these land-based empires and the role of maritime international trade. Okay, so to get us started, I wanted to start by looking at some older EP World History prompts that could be on an EP exam. I know it won't be on the 2020 EP World History exam, but this may be something that could appear in a long essay question in future years, or it could even appear in some format in the DBQ for this year. So for the first prompt, it states, describe and explain continuities and changes in religious beliefs and practices in one of the following regions from 1450 to the present: Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So really, if you were to look at that particular prompt, you would want to look at the roles of Christianity, particularly in places like Ethiopia, and in Egypt, looking at the rise of the Coptic blend of Christianity, and in Latin America and the Caribbean, particularly looking at the role of the Catholic Church, the missionaries, and the Jesuit societies. Likewise, if we were looking at other regions in sub-Saharan Africa, we really would look at the continuing role, it's a continuity of Islam, really as that force for unification to provide people with a common language, a common set of belief systems, and common traditions where it could unite disparate ethnic groups throughout the African region, from places like Timbuktu all the way to Cairo and everywhere in between. Okay, in terms of the continuities for that particular prompt, we're really looking at the role of the trans-Saharan caravans in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of thinking about how the beliefs were spread. And we're looking at the role of transoceanic exploration in Latin America, the encounter between the indigenous peoples of Latin America and the Europeans, most notably the Spanish and the Portuguese, the conquistadors. Okay, so the second prompt is also a continuity and change. I mean, within continuity and change is essentially what are the ways in which things have changed over time, and how have things stayed the same? Like, what are some of the practices that have continued to be important? So, for example, in our last unit, we looked at the role of the Silk Road. The Silk Road was not built in the global age of 1200 to 1450, not at all. It was built in the classical period, looking at the rise of the Roman Empire in the west and the Han Dynasty in the east. But yet, the role and influence of the Silk Road persists for millennia. So if we look at the second prompt, it's continuity and change, and it's asking analyze changes and continuities in the ways one, and this is important because if you get a prompt that asks you to do one thing very specifically, you need to make sure that the evidence that you use is relevant to the prompt at hand and specifically addresses the question. You could have a ton of information about a particular topic, but if your evidence is not relevant to the prompt, you won't get those points. So that would be the EBD, evidence beyond the documents point for the DBQ, and the context point for a DBQ style essay where you have to be able to give broad context. Okay, so the areas that they were looking at in terms of interregional trade, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, and again, kind of looks at the continuities, the role of the trans-Saharan caravans, and the role of the Indian Ocean for maritime trade. But then in terms of a continuity, if you were to look at Latin America's major changes being taking place in terms of the age of sail to getting ships to the New World and around the entire planet. Okay, so the third prompt is comparison, and it's looking at within this period of time, you'd want to restate the time period in the prompt. Compare the processes, political, social, and economic of empire building. So this really dovetails nicely into Unit 3, which is land-based empires, and kind of thinking about it through how these empires were constructed and made over time. So we see the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Qing Empire, respectively in modern-day Turkey, Russia, and in China. And another comparison looks at demographics. So for instance, in your quality of life innovations part gov classes, you would have learned demography looks at various factors such as the age of a group of people, their ethnic background, their gender, their income levels, who they are. Basically, it's the who are you question. And environmental effects. So this is looking at the exchange of plants, animals, and disease in terms of the encounter after 1492. And it's asking you to look at basically what's happening between Africa and Asia, Africa and Europe, or Europe and Asia. Okay, so this is really the world circa 1450 to 1750. Now, notice that the Americas are being excluded. And that's because the Americas really don't come into the picture until the beginnings of the 16th century and the 1500s. Technically, Latin America, there is an encounter in 1492, 1493. There are subsequent voyages of Christopher Columbus, but really the major land-based empires of Latin America will not encounter the Europeans until the arrival of Hernan Cortez in 1519 in modern-day Mexico, looking at Tenochtitlan, which was then the Aztec capital, and then in the late 1520s, culminating in the 1534 conquest of the Inca by Francisco Pizarro. So again, the Western Hemisphere is not really integrated until after the 16th century. So the 16th century is really where they will be built in. And you'll notice here there's a continuation of trade in the Indian Ocean, the Silk Roads, and trans-Saharan caravans. Okay, so some things to keep in mind when we think about the periodization, so understanding the before and after for this time period. We're really looking at how the role of the Age of Exploration will lead to the start of the political revolutions, most commonly illustrated in the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution. So in terms of thinking about this periodization framework, I'd like to begin really thinking about why was there a need for quote-unquote Age of Exploration. So this kind of brings us to the tail end of the last unit of study, which is looking at the Ottoman conquest of Byzantium, specifically their taking over of the city of Constantinople by 1453 and the building of the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean region. This is really important because the Ottomans would begin to implement tax systems. So if the Europeans want to take advantage of work on the Silk Roads or to be able to navigate the Indian Ocean in places like the Red Sea, for example, they're going to have to pay the taxes from the Ottomans. So a lot of the leading European powers, most notably the Spanish and the Portuguese, will try to work through the western tips of Africa, get to the southern region, go around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, most notably Vasco da Gama, looking at the late 1480s, early 1490s, finding a way to get around that southern tip of Africa to be able to still work within the interregional trade networks of the Indian Ocean because it's very, very profitable. And those networks really open during the Crusades, and they become a very, very big part of the European economy. Okay, so we have some major overall themes in terms of understanding state building. We're going to see really rise of centralized governments when we look at land-based empires. So we're going to be looking at places like India with the Mughal Empire. We're going to be looking at the Ming Dynasty in China. We're going to be looking at the rise of the Ottoman Empire. We're going to be looking at the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate. We would be looking at, say, the rise of the French monarchy under the Bourbons, most famous of which Louis XIV, the Sun King, I am the state, leche es moi. These monarchs will try to centralize power within themselves. It's a form known as absolutism. Global trade is sparked by the encounter. Consumerism, we're going to be beginning to see the origins of capitalism, the idea of having monetary currencies. Specifically looking at the rise of silver. Once the Spaniards take advantage of and exploit the Potosi silver mines in modern-day Peru, they're going to use that to buy porcelain. They're going to use that to buy jade from the Chinese. And then the Qing dynasty, that the empire that takes over in 1643, is going to supplant the Ming, and they're going to use silver as a way to establish their dominance as a global empire. And we'll also see the rise of gold. So really gold and silver as hard currencies. And then by the end of the period, looking at the role of beginnings of paper currency. Okay. Coercive labor systems. It is one of the very, very detrimental consequences of the global age. We're going to see the rise of slave labor. And this is going to become very, very important really for two reasons. One, the demographic decline. So when we look at what happened in Spanish Latin America, we see a plunge of the population of up to 90% mortality rate because of the smallpox pandemic. The people of the New World, really looking at the Western Hemisphere, they did not have immunity. They did not have the memory B cells, so the killer T cells, if we're looking at an immunoresponse that the body will have to pathogens that may invade the body. The Spaniards had been exposed to it for hundreds of years, so they did have it. So, as a consequence of diminishing labor supply in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere, the Europeans are going to turn to the African kingdoms, Ghana, they're going to turn to Songhai, they're going to turn to Mali, they're going to turn to the Asante kingdoms, and they're going to begin offering them modern European weapons, firearms, and alcohol, among other things, in exchange for slave labor. So while the Europeans won't be the ones who actually go in, kidnap the people, and bring them to the shores, they're the ones who really take advantage of and exploit the internal African slave trade, and they bring it to a whole new level. And this is why we have, if I remember the numbers off the top of my head correctly, I believe it's about 12 million people are sold into slavery from the Congo Basin region in West Africa and from Ghana region in West Africa to the New World. And one of the tragic consequences, besides the fact that it was a dehumanization process, close to, if not more than, 1 million people died over the voyage to the New World and what was known as the Middle Passage, which is one of the biggest stains on human history. And actually, in many cases, those of you who have taken U.S. history, AP U.S. history, it's one of the original sins, if we want to make a religious connection to the founding of the American state, that it was founded really with slave labor as one of the things to kind of keep in mind, even the building of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Okay, religious rivalries are going to be very important, particularly looking at 30 Years' War in Europe. So from 1618 to 1638, the forces of Protestantism, really looking at Central Europe, modern-day Germany, at the time Prussia and the Habsburg Empire, versus Spain and France, the Catholic empires. And then the other one we really need to be aware of was what is happening between the Holy League, which is essentially a temporary alliance between the Catholics and the Protestants, and the Ottoman Empire, which is going to really come to a head at the Battle of Lepanto, 1571, which is a battle that marks the end of Ottoman expansion west, and it does usher in a new dynamic in empire-to-empire interactions. Likewise, there's a decline in nomads and pastoralism. We'll really begin to see more settled societies. Okay, so circa 1300, what are some key trends? We see the rise of the Islamic Delhi Sultanate as one of the vestiges of the Mongols. We see the founding of the Ottoman dynasty, the Ottoman Empire, 1281, the decline of Byzantium and their eventual conquest by 1453, and the continuity of the trade circuits of the Mediterranean Sea, the Indian Ocean, South China Sea, the Trans-Saharan networks, and the Eurasian steppes along the Silk Roads. So in terms of some things to kind of consider, continuity and change here. So as the world's becoming more integrated, think about the societies who are really in the best position to take advantage of this. So this is really thinking about the effective use of the new technologies, of gunpowder, of the sailing ships, of fast-growing champa rice. If you haven't figured it out yet, I'm hinting at the Ming Dynasty. They're going to become very, very powerful in this time. Okay, so thinking about what's happening here, so under the Ming Dynasty, we're going to see the expansion, the largest expansion, in fact, in all of Chinese history, of the Great Wall. Although it was initially constructed during the Han Dynasty, it was really the threat of the Mongols and the fact that the Mongols actually conquered and subjugated the Chinese for about 100 years. So really looking up until 1368, so really in that period, in the 13th century, the 1200s, the Mongols are really going to have a lot of power. Eventually, the Ming are going to lose the mandate of heaven by 1644. The Manchus come into power, and then by the revolution of 1911, 1912, that will be supplanted by the Republic of China and the end of the dynastic system in China. Okay, so in terms of the Ming Dynasty, some things to kind of keep in mind. So once the Mongols are out, we're going to see a revival of Chinese culture. Neo-Confucianism is going to reassert itself. As I spoke about before, the continued use of champa rice, it'll be sent north from southern China along the Grand Canal into northern Chinese cities, Shanghai, Beijing, etc. And that will be used for a population explosion during this time. We'll see the continued use of public work projects, and it really will be their products that will begin to make a difference in the global balance of trade. Paper, porcelain, silk, eventually tea will become major products of demand. The Europeans are allowed to arrive at particular ports. They're not allowed to go wherever they want. That's not going to happen for centuries until the Opium Wars of the 19th century. At this point, China is really dominating that system of trade. In the Indian Ocean, they have major ports at Hangzhou, Guangzhou, and Guangzhou. They're trading for silver with the Europeans. They're getting from their Latin American colonies and with the Japanese. Okay, so in terms of state power, they're going to use absolute government. So Hongwu is going to remove the chief minister's position. They're going to create and develop the imperial city, what becomes known as the forbidden city in terms of who's not allowed to go through there. We're going to be seeing through the Yongle Emperor and the Third Emperor in particular the rise of the treasure fleets in China and the role of the Chinese Navy prior to the middle decades of the 15th century as really establishing major control. Some historians claim that had China not turned inward, that they might have actually maintained their naval supremacy well into the Industrial Revolution. It's hard to really say. It's one of those what if scenarios. These are some other details to keep in mind, maybe things to make notes of, or things to look over again before you take the AP exam if you need that little bit of content review. Okay, in terms of the Japan, we're looking at the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate. Three major figures you should be aware of. Really, the third one is still going to be the one that you would want to include on an AP exam if you wanted to include either context for DBQ, if the DBQ asked you something related to East Asian trade systems or state building, and that's Tokugawa Ieyasu. He consolidates power, he unifies the various daimyos, the nobility of Japan, each done with their own decentralized fiefdoms. But he does build on the legacy of the people that came before him. I like this quote. It says, Ieyasu ate the pie that Nobunaga made and Hideyoshi baked. Basically, again, it's not just that like snap of the fingers, turn on the light switch, and then new empire. Like that's not how many empires are actually formed. It's usually a process that unfolds over several decades. Okay, so some things to keep in mind for the Tokugawa. So Ieyasu switches the capital from Kyoto, which had been the capital for centuries, dating back to the Heian period. He brings it to Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo. He leads the bureaucracy. He controls the nobility. He ensures Tokugawa succession. So some things to keep in mind. Before they go into a policy of isolation, they do welcome trade at first, particularly to get weapons, military technology. Very similar to what the Meiji are going to do when they kicked the Tokugawa out in the middle decades of the 1800s. I believe 1868 is going to be the Meiji Restoration. And that will be when they essentially bring in Western technology and become an industrialized power. We're not there yet. We're looking at 1450 to 1750. So this is really the rise of the samurai. This is when they close their borders and they restrict foreign trade. Okay, so the Ottoman Empire is our next major empire. They are a land-based empire. And again, note how long they are in power for, 1281 to 1914. This is an example of an illustration of an invasion of a fortified medieval city, the Byzantines. So if we look, by the 1350s, Osman comes into power. He begins establishing this dynasty. We see the rise of the Janissary Corps. Basically, what they did was they would take Christians who were living as subjects in their empire. They would essentially coerce their parents into giving them up when they're 8, 9, 10 years old. They would be converted to Islam, but the most important thing was they were taken away from their families. So, yes, on the one hand, the families lost their children, but they were also promised, and in many cases, actually given high ranking government positions in the Ottoman bureaucracy with the opportunity to really do better in many ways than they would have done if they had stayed at home. But likewise, it wasn't really much of a choice. By 1453, Mehmed II conquers Constantinople, takes over Byzantium, renames the city Istanbul. It's still named Istanbul today in 2020. So this is something to kind of keep in mind. Suleiman In slightly later decades, he advances to the borders of Hungary and Austria, never quite gets there. They even try to continue a century after the Battle of Lepanto to siege Vienna. It doesn't work. At this point, by the Battle of Lepanto and by the siege of Vienna, they're going into decline. Really, by 1914, the First World War, they're the sick man of Europe. They're not doing well, and they're going into decline. By 1923, the empire is dissolved. Kemal Mustafa Ataturk comes into power, and we see the Republic of Turkey. Okay, so some things to keep in mind with the Ottoman Empire. By 1672, this is their empire. Notice they took over Greece. Greece won't get their independence until the 1820s. They take over modern-day Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia, Herzegovina, essentially large swaths of Southeast Europe. These are things to kind of keep in mind because really they're at the border. This is Rome. They're at the border of the Europe of the European powers at the time. The Sultan is an absolute monarch. He has absolute authority. Uh, in terms of understanding something to keep in mind, it is a gunpowder civilization. The reason why the Ottomans are so successful is they are able to take the gunpowder that was used in Chinese rockets and build cannons. And by building the cannons and siege equipment, they're able to really assert their dominance in the Mediterranean region and the Red Sea. Okay, so in terms of understanding their decline, well, just like with any empire, when they fall into decline, you have a vacuum in effective leadership. The sultans are neglecting their empire, overexpansion of the territories. It was getting too big for them to really administer effectively. Corrupted officials, and really not advancing and adapting with their times. The Ottomans do not take full advantage of industrialization, and because they don't take full advantage of industrialization, they begin to lag behind the European powers. Okay, so moving to Central Asia, looking at the subcontinent in South Asia and India, the Mughal Empire is going to be the key empire of India at the time. It's an Islamic based empire. It is rooted in their military strength. They're never able to conquer all of India. In fact, the vast majority of the middle of the continent to southern India remains independent throughout this time. Mughal Empire really only controls the northern regions here. So, why are we talking about them? Well, for example, Akbar is also called Akbar the Great. He builds upon his father's conquest, Babur, and he converts to understanding Buddhism and Hinduism. So he really looks at this idea of religious tolerance. And it is through religious tolerance that he's viewed in many ways as a great leader, as in many cases, in some cases, scholar. Okay, shifting over to Latin America, a couple of things to keep in mind. You learn a lot in class about the rise of Spanish America and the role of the haciendas, the role of the encomiendas, and their social hierarchy system. But it's important to understand that Portugal's there too. And they begin to establish an empire in Brazil. It's the reason why they speak Portuguese in Brazil today and not Spanish. So in 1494, Spain and Brazil agree. Okay, so we're going to divide the Western Hemisphere by a latitude line. They call it the Treaty of Tordesillas, and essentially the Spanish got the territory to the left, and the Portuguese got the territory to the right. What's really important to understand in terms of the demographics, besides Haiti and Cuba and that region of the Caribbean, the Brazilians are going to be the most heavily involved in the slave labor system. And it's one of the reasons why, demographically speaking, there are many people of African ancestry in Brazil today because of the sugar industry. Specifically, looking at the rise and the role of sugar, it will become one of those commodities that is highly sought after and things that people really want to get. They become the largest producer of sugar. These two are directly interdependent upon one another. And when we think about the triangle trade, understanding the system of system of slaves coming in from Africa into the New World, from the New World getting the products of sugar, rum, molasses, tobacco to Europe, and then from Europe essentially selling alcohol and weapons to the West African kingdoms in exchange for slave labor. Okay, so thinking about some other empires here. So Spain, 1492, the Reconquista is done. They've reclaimed Granada from the remnants of the Umayyad Caliphate. The people they called the Moors, who had controlled Spain since 728. Understanding that is important because with the Reconquista, the Spanish are able to turn west and focus their attention on the New World, on Latin America, with this encounter, with this existing system that had been around for thousands of years, but had been completely new to the European mindset. So, as I mentioned before, 1519, Cortez arrives in Mexico, Pizarro, 1534, in Peru, they take over. And essentially, instead of creating something from scratch, they took over the existing tributary empires. So instead of trying to create a whole new system, they built on the system that was already there. So, for example, the labor system was the Mita system. The Spanish just built on what was already there. As I spoke about before, disease and death, two very clear consequences of the Spanish Empire. But mestizo is important too, understanding the mixed races that really begin to appear in Latin America. And understanding that these were not always consensual relationships is important too in understanding how the modern world is made and really kind of thinking about the tragic consequences of what happens when these things occur. Okay, so the Dutch is an empire that may be tested. They're not tested very often, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. But a couple of things to keep in mind: they are a business or a commercial enterprise. They're really looking at the Dutch East India Company. Um, they're really looking at Southeast Asia in terms of understanding what is happening with spice trades, Malacca, places like that. Actually, you can see it right here. It says cloves of Malacca, pepper and 10, nutmeg and Banda Islands. They do create a way station in South Africa. They do initially have Caribbean outposts, but they're supplanted by the French and by the Spanish later on. Okay, so some things to keep in mind: exploration, God, gold, glory? Question mark. Empire building, cartography, understanding how maps are created, and then the commodities, thinking about the role of the products that are being traded at the time. Okay, so as I mentioned before, sugar, silver, slaves, very important to understanding this moment in world history. Coffee beans, so really discovered in, I believe, the 10th or the 11th century in Yemen, and then later in Europe and the Americas. It is another one of those products, particularly in Cuba, that becomes very important in understanding the role of labor systems, from slave-based systems to contract labor, sort of like indentured servitude, towards piecemeal labor systems where people sign up to work on these work contracts here. Also looking at the role of chocolate, early cacao as a system building on the Aztecs from the 17th century. Okay, African societies. There's quite a few actually to be aware of. In terms of the exam, I can really only see them testing the Asante Kingdom, maybe Songhai, and this is really looking at West Africa during this time period, the collapse of Mali and their takeover by the Songhai and by the Asante Kingdoms. A couple of large centralized states, building on the trans-Saharan trades, there's a clear sense of continuity at the time, international commerce, tax trade, etc. All right, so some centralized kingdoms keep in mind. We're looking at Benin, Congo, and the Asante Kingdom. And these are some of the figures, and this kind of speaks to what I was talking about verbally before, with how the Europeans interacted with these African leaders in terms of establishing their own trading system and the kinds of products that would be sold for slaves. Okay, Russia. They are a centralized power in Eastern Europe. This is really looking at the role of Peter the Fourth, otherwise known as Peter the Great. He accelerates the westernization process. So he's an absolute monarch as well, goes to war with Sweden. Really, the only thing I think you need to keep in mind with understanding Russia is it's at this time period where they begin to expand east from Moscow into modern day Siberia and really looking at the role of the Russian Orthodox Church after the split in 1054, the Great Schism, understanding their blend of Christianity. Okay, so some things to keep in mind. In Europe, Protestant Reformation is going to be very important. Martin Luther, the Lutheran Church, John Calvin, Calvinism, the Methodists, etc. Really big picture, just keep in mind that the role, the power of the Catholic Church goes into decline on many levels. And we see, especially in Central Europe, the role of the Protestant Church, Protestant churches in blends. In East Asia, there's a resurgence of Neo-Confucianism, the civil service exam, so on and so forth. And in terms of missionaries, we're going to see Christianity in Latin America, the role of the Jesuits. We're going to look at the role of Islam in Africa and the role of South Asia, um, and Buddhism as well. So comparison. So again, there is no LEQ on this exam, so you're probably not going to see a comparison style question, but they may give you a DBQ that might look at particular systems of trade during the period 1450 to 1750. So take a minute, look at some comparisons that could be made. So, just some things to kind of just speak to briefly. We're beginning to see the origins of imperialism and colonialism, colonial states, and how they're administered differently from the Europeans in Latin America to land based Asian empires, with the role of the Qing dynasty in China taking over Korea. Okay, so let's see. Using some regions below, consider how each exemplifies the big picture themes of the time period. So, if we're thinking about absolutism, global trade, consumerism, the rise of Europe, coercive labor systems, religious rivalries, and the decline of nomads, how could we fit each of these major themes into the empires that emerge during this period in 1450 to 1750? All right, and that is going to bring us to the end of today's mini lecture on these units. Just going to scroll back through to the beginning. And just again, look over the time period, so 1450 to 1750 were the topics covered in today's lecture, and really looking at the role of transoceanic interconnections, like what's happening in the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and what happened in terms of the rise of major land-based empires. All right, so that'll do it for today. I look forward to discussing these ideas with you further in our live session where we'll look at a sample DBQ from this time period. All right, everybody, have a great day.